This video is sponsored by Ground News. I remember the first time I went to the doctor's office, age 13, seeking testosterone as a part of my transition. It was a painfully bright and pale room. The doctor stumbled through a questionnaire he had never read before. He asked me why I wanted to transition from female to male. I told him the story he wanted to hear. Ever since I was a young child, I've been a boy trapped in a girl's body, and during puberty, I became ever more uncomfortable with my body. These words aren't really mine, but I'm not allowed to say that. 10 years later, it's dangerous to say that. It's even more dangerous to be who I am. In March of 2024, the UK's National Health Service announced that it would be banning the use of puberty blockers as treatment for gender dysphoria in children. As a trans person who went through puberty as both a man and a woman, I say we should ban puberty instead. Trans advocates were quick to condemn the NHS's decision since puberty blockers play a key role in the lives of the trans children who need them. These blockers allow trans kids to put a pause on puberty and give them time to decide whether or not gender transition is a path for them. The NHS made the controversial decision after the publication of a report on the efficacy of puberty blockers conducted by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Nice. The recently publicized full version of that review, now known as the infamous Cass review, concluded that there was insufficient evidence to show that puberty blockers positively impacted the gender dysphoria and mental health of children who take them. Well, what does that mean? Understanding complex news like this is both difficult and important, but there are tools that can help us sort through the noise. One of the tools that I use is Ground News. Ground News is a unique news app and website that lets you compare how different media outlets from all over the world cover the same story. Ground News is a key part of my research toolkit, and I encourage you to check it out at ground.news/Alexander Avila. When researching the Cass review, for example, Ground News was a crucial resource in helping me understand the political spin that different outlets took on gender-affirming care. On Ground News, I can see that nearly 100 sources covered the Cass review. The bias distribution feature lets me know that these sources were disproportionately right-wing. If I scroll down, I can quickly compare headlines from outlets with different political leanings, verify how factual the source tends to be, and who owns the media outlet. In quickly glancing on the different articles covering the Cass review, I can see that the left-leaning sources tend to center trans kids as a group that needs more evidence-based support, while the right tends to moralize the issue by using heated terms about gender-affirming care like chemical castration, scandal, and gender ideology. In our polarized and sensational media landscape, it can be disheartening to see outlets misrepresent the facts, especially when their reporting can directly impact the communities we care about. Instead of letting the algorithm feed you half-truths, Ground News lets you reclaim ownership of the issues that you care about through curated feeds. You can discover tons of different topics to diversify your media palette. I personally follow LGBTQ+ and transgender news, so I can stay updated in a time of unprecedented attack on queer rights across the world. If you're tired of sorting through an algorithmic sludge of news-turned content, I highly recommend subscribing to Ground News by scanning the QR code or using my link ground.news/Alexander Avila to get 40% off unlimited access with the Vantage subscription, or to try it for less than $1 a month. That's once again ground.news/Alexander Avila, or the QR code right here. Back to the Cass review. When it claimed insufficient evidence in support of gender-affirming care for children, what does that mean? Does that mean that they read all the studies and that the studies reported mixed results? Does it mean that in some studies puberty blockers negatively impacted gender dysphoria and mental health, and in others it positively impacted these outcomes? Well, first, let's start with the NICE report, which was used to inform the Cass review and which was directly cited in the NHS policy decision against puberty blockers. The NICE report claimed that much of the available evidence was low quality because the studies weren't double-blind randomized control trials. For those of you who don't keep up with the medical fandom, a double-blind randomized control trial is when you take your study participants and randomly assign them to two groups, where one group gets the treatment and the other group doesn't get the treatment. And the delicious twist that makes this all the more scientific is that neither the researcher, who directly interacts with the participants, nor the study participants themselves knows who received the treatment. So wait, why don't they do that for gender-affirming care? I want it! Hey, but let's use our noggins for a moment. Have you considered the boob problem or the beard problem, it's going to be really obvious to both the researcher and the participant who received the puberty blockers, because those that didn't would start going through puberty. Another problem. It's just a wee bit unethical to deny a group of people a treatment that may or may not be life-saving, right? Here's a fun fact. I was a trans kid. I started my transition around age 12, changed my name at 15, and began hormones at age 17. Then I changed my name again, started selling bootleg DVDs, and have been a fugitive ever since. Transitioning saved my life. If I didn't start hormones when I did, I might not be here today. Gender-affirming care for someone like me was absolutely necessary if I wanted to live a healthy and fulfilling life. And now, if I wanted to live one, I could. So, let's say you were to do a randomized control trial and deny kids some life-saving gender-affirming care. That's kind of psychological torture, and according to the data, people don't like psychological torture, so it's likely that a lot of kids would probably end up dropping out of a randomized control trial, which is why experts in trans healthcare don't design studies like this. Double-blind, randomized control trials in trans healthcare are morally dubious and practically impossible.
And even Dr. Cass, the literal director of the review herself, states that randomized control trials are inappropriate and impossible in trans healthcare. So why didn't she mention this in the final report? Why isn't this highlighted more strongly? Why was the NHS allowed to make policy decisions based on the nice evidence reviews when its guidelines are based on evaluation criteria that are, in her words, inappropriate and impossible? But let's be #fair and balanced. The studies commissioned for the Cass review, to their credit, used a different, more appropriate rating system than the NICE report. Nice. Overall, these systematic reviews are good reviews and point out the fact that we need more research. Fine, more research is good. Importantly, the authors write that there's evidence to show a positive association between gender-affirming care and psychological outcomes. But that's not what gets reported by the media, right? Right-wing sources are crying that the Cass review heralds the death of gender-affirming care, that the review proves that gender-affirming care is harmful, that it's all built on shaky foundations. But that's just not true. But let's get to the meat of the issue. Why are we doing this?
Surely because the public has well-meaning, nuanced, good-faith, gluten-free questions about the safety of a small group of children they've likely never interacted with, right?
The Cass review is asking the real questions, like, why has the rate of trans youth exponentially increased, huh? The growth rate of trans youth cases isn't as dramatic as the report implies. Epidemiologist Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz has a fantastic analysis of the report, linked below. He graphed the UK's data on a logarithmic scale to demonstrate that the exponential increase in cases actually occurred in 2009, which suggests a statistically significant probability that the reactionary outrage leading to the Cass review is fake and gay. Yet, the Cass review uncritically runs with the outrage, humoring the ableist narrative that trans identity is somehow suspiciously linked with certain mental health conditions, or even social contagion, despite there being no high-quality evidence for these claims. Why would the review omit the fact that the increase in trans youth is on par with the increase in other LGBTQ+ identities? Why wouldn't the review mention the fact that the diagnostic understanding of gender identity changed in 2013 with the new edition of the DSM, leading to a completely unsuspicious and plausible increase in the amount of gender dysphoria-related referrals? And even then, why does the report frame an increase in trans kids as a social problem? Why does it feel like the report problematizes trans existence, as if, in an ideal world, we should do everything in our power to prevent more trans kids from existing? Okay, so maybe there isn't an exponential explosion of trans kids, but there's still a lot more than there were before. Shouldn't we be more careful and selective about the kids who receive gender-affirming care? Well, we already are. The Cass Review's data includes a sample of 3,306 kids referred to gender identity services in the UK. These are kids brought to the doctor for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they're gender non-conforming kids whose parents saw a documentary about trans kids and thought it warranted further questioning. Perhaps they're kids who, ever since they could talk, insisted that they're a different gender than the one assigned to them at birth. There's a wide range of people referred to gender services. Not all of them need gender-affirming care, and that's fine. We go to the doctors when we feel like there might be a problem, and then they refer us out to someone else. Right? Not all of these kids were given blockers and hormones right away. Of the 3,000 or so kids referred to gender identity services, only 22% of them ended up seeking out medical treatment. But there's a lot more to this number. From their referral to gender identity services, the median number of appointments that kids underwent before even being referred to endocrinology, or the hormone doctor, was 6 appointments. And keep in mind, the waiting list for an initial consultation for gender identity services is years. That's just for the first appointment to even be referred for the medical treatment in the first place. And after years on the waiting list, after several appointments with weeks or months in between them, the waiting list for the endocrinologist can last weeks or months. And even then, there's no guarantee that the endocrinologist prescribes medication on the first visit. So you're telling me that the exponential explosion in trans kids isn't really happening the way people think it is? That the evidence for the social contagion hypothesis doesn't exist? And that kids actually have to wait years on a waiting list to even start their transition? It seems like the CAS review has all the material to address the concerns of anti-transition critics, but CAS fails to put it all together. Why isn't this a key takeaway of the report? Why isn't this a main point mentioned in the conclusion? But nice to know you have our backs, Doctor.
So, are these puberty blockers and gender fluids even safe? Well, all medicine has side effects and potential negative outcomes. Even the water is turning the frogs gay. Gender-affirming care isn't so different. When I was speaking to an endocrinologist at age 15 about the possibility of going on puberty blockers, she told me that there was evidence to show that puberty blockers may negatively impact bone density. We had a conversation about the pros and cons of going on blockers, about the fact that I was pretty much done with puberty at that point, about how puberty blockers probably wouldn't do much, and that once I was eligible for testosterone, it would probably take care of a lot of the dysphoria anyways. After this conversation, I didn't end up going on puberty blockers. This is what gender-affirming care should, and often does, look like. Conversations, thoughts, and informed decisions. And it's true, as my endocrinologist said, puberty blockers are associated with twinkie gay bones. But even then, these issues tend to be resolved once children either stop the blockers and undergo the biological puberty of their natal sex, or if they begin taking gender-affirming hormones. Here's the thing though. Clinicians have been prescribing puberty blockers to cisgender kids since the early 90s as a treatment for early puberty. One of the key reasons that clinicians offer puberty blockers to cisgender kids is because of the negative mental health impacts associated with the social stigma of early development. Similar to trans kids, cisgender kids use puberty blockers to alleviate the mental distress associated with undergoing a puberty that doesn't feel quite right. But no one cared about adverse outcomes until puberty blockers were being given to trans kids. So why do people care about a 30-year-old drug now?
We'd like to believe that most medicine is based on firm, rigorous science, but not every treatment has 20 years of double-blind randomized control trials behind it. Some research finds that only 10% of all medical treatments are based on high-quality evidence. So why do we uniquely scrutinize and single out research on trans kids, especially since we know it's a much smaller and therefore difficult population to study?
I think you know why.
There's a lot of things to criticize about the CAS review, but there's one thing that seems to be particularly exemplary. Trans people were deliberately excluded from joining key oversight teams for fear of introducing bias.
Well, that's perfectly reasonable because, as you know, cisgender people are notoriously unbiased when it comes to trans healthcare. Now, I understand the logic here. I really do. I totally disagree with it, but I understand that trans people are likely to have a personal investment when researching this issue, and for some reason caring about things is icky. But to not include a single trans person, or a trans healthcare expert at least, on these key oversight teams, to not include those who can provide informed pushback or provide a critical lens, is not to exclude bias, but to trade one bias for another.
Dr. Hilary Cass was chosen to lead the evidence review because of her lack of expertise in trans healthcare. In what other branch of medicine do we intentionally exclude key stakeholders and experts from medical policy research? This is the fundamental problem. It's not that she's some secret far-right figure or a transphobic plant. In fact, in the past few days, she's clarified that she supports youth access to puberty blockers and hormones. Yet, right-wing publications and figures are upholding the Cass Review as the end of gender-affirming care as we know it. Dr. Cass was not equipped to handle this subject, good intentions or not. The review was doomed to fail.
As trans people, we rarely get the chance to contribute to popular public narratives about our own lives. We are often introduced to the public by dude bros with microphones who problematize our existence.
Matt Walsh is a popular right-wing commentator who runs a TikTok React channel where divorced guys listen to a grown man bully trans people for money. You may know him from prolific and incisive works like I Am a Racist.
Here he is on Joe Rogan making outrageous claims about the number of people on puberty blockers.
You're talking about hormone blockers.
Yeah.
Millions of kids have been on hormone blockers? Really?
I'm sure someone's going to fact check me on that, but my guess is that we're into the millions now at this point. Yeah, that would be my guess.
Only to have Joe Rogan immediately fact check him.
It says over the last 5 years, there were at least 4,780 adolescents who started puberty blockers and had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis.
It says it's kind of undercounted, but that
would be a big undercounting.
Less than 1,000 people a year.
Getting fact-checked by Joe Rogan is like having a gay person tell you you're a shitty driver. Hey Matt, do you know how many kids were on puberty blockers at the time the NHS banned them in March of 2024? Fewer than 100.
Million sounds great.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm not saying there's no room for discussion. Gender-affirming care is tricky, and it requires a lot of tough conversations. I had a lot of those conversations. But let's be honest here. This isn't about protecting kids.
If it was, then the Cass Review wouldn't have to generate fake ones with artificial intelligence. Did they not think we would notice?
When was the last time a politicized campaign to save the kids ever was? This is about something deeper. This is about the perceived threat that trans people pose to a system of oppressive gendered control that underlies all of our beliefs, institution, and traditional ways of life. Under this framework, right-wing commentators turn transgender people into transgender isms, into evil abstractions that we need to debate into oblivion, as if people won't die along the way. We've all been convinced that trans kids are this radical new phenomenon that progressive discourse shat out 5 minutes ago. But the phenomenon that we call trans kids actually has a nearly 100-year history. Though the terms transgender or gender dysphoria were created in the past few decades, gender-divergent children in the Western world have appeared in medical archives going back to the early 20th century. The book, Histories of the Transgender Child, documents these early cases of trans childhood. One of these people was a girl named Val. Val was born sometime in the 1920s, and though assigned male at birth, from a young age insisted on living as a girl. Val's parents, well connected with their local community, were able to convince the school to allow Val to attend as a girl. This was in the 1930s. Before we even had the word transgender, children like Val have been insisting on making their lives livable. It's a different story today. Over the past few years, a new anti-trans movement, often labeled the anti-gender movement, has provided their own alternative reading of trans people's new public visibility. The anti-gender movement claims that the transgender craze is the product of a new insidious ideology pushed by queer theorists and online pronoun terrorists. Trans people have captured the reactionary imagination despite making up less than 1% of the world's population. In 2023, legislatures across the United States introduced 185 bills targeting gender-affirming care. Guess how many bills there were just 5 years earlier in 2018? 2. Donald Trump, who in 2016 said that trans woman Caitlyn Jenner was welcome to use any bathroom she pleases in the Trump Tower, said just a year ago,
"We're going to defeat the cult of gender ideology and reaffirm that God created two genders."
Pope Francis called gender ideology today's worst danger. Which is weird considering that most trans people I know can't even order extra water at a restaurant. But what the hell is gender ideology? What idea could be so dangerous as to mobilize the world's most prominent political and religious figures against it? Welcome to your mandatory diversity training. So, what is gender ideology? Well, it isn't all that clear, but from what I've gathered in reading conservative discussions about it, those in the anti-gender movement describe gender ideology as the belief in a few different things. Number one, the distinction between sex as a biological description and gender as a cultural construction, also known as the sex and gender distinction. Number two, the idea that sex and gender are not binary phenomena. Number three, the concept of gender identity as our internal and essential sense of gender. And number four, the idea that one can have a gender identity that does not match one's sex assigned at birth. Now, if you're a progressive, you might find yourself nervously nodding along. And to that I say, buddy, hey, maybe you should relax, it's a little unnerving. And if you're a conservative, you might find yourself recoiling at the very suggestion. Both of you, settle down, because you know what? I don't agree with this conception of gender. Neither does queer theorist Judith Butler, even though they're often blamed for creating gender ideology in the first place. Hell, most academics in queer and trans studies probably disagree with this framework. So what gives? Was it all a Tumblr psyop? First of all, I think this whole thing is a simplistic, even incoherent way to think about gender. I mean, how can you be born with an internal and essential sense of gender despite it being a social construct? I don't know if that's reconcilable. And you know what? I don't think sex and gender are as distinct as mainstream liberal discourses claim them to be. What people don't understand is that you can be against this simplistic framework and still believe that trans people exist and deserve rights. In fact, to create better, more honest discourses about trans rights, we need to understand sex and gender in a different way. The current language we have around gender identity is painfully inadequate, and even then, it just doesn't even work as a political strategy. Gender ideology canceled. According to recent survey data, when Americans were asked whether or not they supported basic discrimination protections for trans people, most said yes. But the same research showed that most Americans also believe that an individual's gender is determined by the sex they were assigned at birth. Americans canceled. In a confusing twist, Americans support trans people in practice, just not in theory. Another interesting fact. When you ask Americans what has influenced their views on gender the most, the top response is what they learned from science. Let's break that down. Whether or not respondents claim that someone's gender is always determined by their sex assigned at birth, or that someone's gender can be different from their sex at birth, the top justification for respondents' beliefs was still what they learned from science. Both those who believe in trans-affirmative or non-trans-affirmative models of sex and gender feel as if their beliefs are influenced by what they learned from science. How could science be teaching two fundamentally contradictory ideas? How can science, the supposed arbiter of truth, the final legitimate authority over nature, leave people with two completely different versions of reality? Well, because science isn't really one thing with one answer. It isn't an oracle that gives us a final yes or no. In reality, there is no one science. Science is the constantly changing and ever-debated process of deciding what knowledge our society accepts as legitimate knowledge. The process of producing scientific knowledge often involves power hierarchies, excluded voices, and gaps in our understanding. That doesn't mean that scientific institutions are doomed, and that nothing means anything. Just that scientific disciplines, just like all other disciplines, exist within an evolving historical context. The way science is funded, the characteristics of the people involved in science, the choice to study one thing and not the other. These components are always the sites of social conflict, and we shouldn't be afraid of that fact. Postmodern boogeyman Michel Foucault dedicated a lot of his time to writing books that Jordan Peterson didn't read, about how scientific knowledge is historically and socially constructed. Put simply, our society has underlying rulebooks for what we consider truth, and these rulebooks are often written by those at the top of society's power hierarchy. Gender
is the perfect example. To demonstrate this, let's take a closer look at the history of the ideas that conservatives now label gender ideology. You know, the idea that sex and gender are different, the idea of gender identity, and so on. If these ideas didn't emerge from Judith Butler or queer theorists or Tumblrinas, then where did they actually come from? Why did these ideas appear at the moment in which they did? Who do they actually serve? If we take a step back and follow the history of the word, we actually find a history totally opposed to trans people's rights. We find a history totally opposed to the idea of non-binary gender fluidity. We find that the concept of gender was actually created to reinforce the rigid gender roles that conservatives claim it challenges. Let's start with sex. Society wants us to believe that the biological categories of male and female are transhistorical, universal, and stable. But the story is far more complicated. Now, while there is a well-documented history of non-binary gender categories in many cultures, since the beginning of recorded history, most cultures seem to recognize, generally, two gendered categories: the male and female, the masculine and feminine, men and women. But what does that mean exactly? Because these weren't always biological categories. Biology, the modern discipline we know today as biology, didn't exist. Now I get what you might be thinking. Penis and vagina, that's as biological as it gets, case closed. But these weren't always biological objects. The body was not always viewed and therefore treated as a biological object. Biology is a modern discipline that carries with it a modern lens. The concept of biological, as we understand it today, didn't exist in antiquity. Biology is a 19th century invention born out of a particular pattern of thought.
Historians want to write histories of biology in the 18th century, but they do not realize that biology did not exist then, and that the pattern of knowledge that has been familiar to us for 150 years is not valid for a previous period.
This isn't to say that there weren't plant dudes studying plants. There were, and anatomy has existed as long as the Greeks were taking it up the ass. When Foucault says that biology did not exist, he's saying that the modern biological sciences require a contemporary way of viewing the world. In order to do biology, you have to be able to think in terms of abstract notions like life, systems, and function. But this pattern of thought wasn't really common until the 19th century. First, we have to understand that knowledge creation isn't a straightforward thing. There's rules for admission, but these rules aren't written anywhere. They are underlying cultural understandings that change over time. Our society and culture has rules that determine what gets to be added to the official knowledge pile. Not only do these rules concern who gets to produce knowledge, but what actually counts as legitimate knowledge. And over time, these rules change drastically, even fundamentally. Let's take a famous example from Foucault's book, The Order of Things. Pretend you're a horse girl. Horses are your life. You're in so deep that you're reading pre-19th century texts about the natural history of horses. Horse girl, what would you expect to find in an official and respectable book about the natural properties of horses? As you peruse these equestrian natural histories, you start to notice something. You start to notice that in books written before the 17th century, or the medieval period, books about the nature of horses contain what you expect. Observations about horse features, drawings of its organs, horse diets, but there's also a wealth of other information. Fables including horses, poems written about horses, horse tropes and folklore. Basically, everything that falls under the symbolic universe of horse is a part of its official, objective, natural knowledge. But then you notice that in books written after the 17th century, or in the classical period, the natural history of horses omits these fables and poems. Books from the classical period only tell you observable facts about the horse. Why? Because between the medieval and classical period, the rules for creating knowledge changed. In the medieval period, the job of science was to repeat what had been said about an object, while in the classical period, the job of science was to directly observe and precisely describe what one can see about an object. The medieval form of knowledge production recognized words and symbols as a part of the object of study and as a crucial part of its history. But then, in the classical period, these words and symbols became re-understood as mere representations of the physical plane. Was natural historian Conradi Gessner a stupid, smooth-brained idiot for including folklore and fables in his 16th century masterpiece, the Historia Animalium? In my personal opinion, no. I love it. It's cute. It's camp. Compare that to a natural history from the classical period, like John Johnston's ridiculously overpriced and overhyped Historia Naturalis de Quadrupedibus. It omits all the symbols and literary flair. It's dead, it's dry. And the information isn't even that much better than Al Giovanni's Renaissance-era hit Historia Naturalis, which does include the cute little stories. Did the rules for knowledge production actually improve from the medieval to the classical age? Well, not really. You could even say that natural history lost a lot of valuable information. Even if the actual collected facts became more accurate over time, the method of organizing and understanding these facts changed in ways that were neither better nor worse than what preceded them. The classical period didn't get better or worse at creating knowledge. The rules just changed, for a mess of sociological and historical reasons. Knowledge is not an objective and linear pursuit of truth, but a contingent, changing, and socially negotiated process. So let's go back to biology. Where did biology come from? What were the historical conditions that allowed biology to exist in the first place? We can trace the origins of modern Western biology to what I've been previously mentioning, natural history. Natural history has existed as long as Romans were taking it up the ass. Natural history started out studying what you're probably thinking of as nature. Plants, birds, rocks, dirt, and what is generally not made by humans. But when these neurodivergent plant dudes were making their little books about nature in the 18th century, their concept of life, or living object, held a different weight than it does today. Back in the day, natural historians considered the category of living thing as just another characteristic in a list of descriptions, another observation to be made. But suddenly, there was a conceptual shift. In the 19th century, a society transitioned from the classical to the modern period. As society industrialized and capitalism became the ruling social feeling, people began to understand the world in a different way. The modern lens saw the world in terms of systems, functions, hierarchies, and instruments. And when it turned that lens onto living beings, it birthed the modern concept of life. And with it, the study of life, biology. The 17th century natural historian understood aliveness as one of many characteristics, one possible effect of matter among many. But the modern biologist understood life as a functional system, an organic structure. Life was no longer just an effect or a characteristic. It became the object of study. Life became a transcendental idea underlying the movement of all organic living beings. Life gave living objects a meaning, a purpose, a direction, a plan. The idea of life as a functional system and the accompanying discipline of biology fundamentally altered how we understand living beings. Here's another example from Foucault to illustrate this. Under the classical system of taxonomy, a fish's gill and a human's lung have no relation to one another. The classical natural historian would study gills and lungs and say, they don't have the same form, size, or shape. These things aren't observationally similar, so they aren't really related. But in the modern period, the biologist, who understands life as system and function, would argue that the gill and lung perform a similar role. The gill and lung both function in the system of respiration. But that functional role isn't a similarity that you can directly observe with your eyes. This is a similarity that requires a type of framework of understanding of what life is and does as an organic system. This framework is what makes biology possible. Much of our lives are governed by these invisible relationships and patterns of thought. That doesn't mean that these aren't real and powerful relationships, but they're not inherent and universal. The frameworks we use to understand the world are given to us by language and culture. Consider this important cultural image from the American sitcom The Simpsons. Sneeds feed and seed, formerly Chucks. Do you get it? It's a joke. Sneed's feed and seed establishes a rhyme scheme in which all of the titular words end with "ed." As the viewer notices this pattern, they notice
the formerly chucks at the bottom of the sign. The viewer is then forced to conduct the replacement in their head while considering the pre-established pattern of rhyme. If the place was once Chuck's and we reapply the established rhyme scheme, then the business's former name must have conformed to an uck rhyme pattern. This place was once Chuck's fucking suck. Gold. But this pattern is invisible. This coherence is built on layers and layers of stuff. It is a Taco Bell 7-layer burrito, deceptively advertised to contain 7 independent layers of individual flavors: tomatoes, refried beans, seasoned rice, 3 cheese blends, low-fat sour cream, guacamole, and lettuce. But when you take a bite, these 7 layers lose their individual identity. It all mashes together to form the distinct taste of a 7-layer burrito, a flavor profile with its own depth, its own history and associations. You've made memories with this burrito as a burrito. You've built a life with it. It's tangy, it's goopy, it's real. We only understand this joke because we are culturally primed to understand humor, rhyme, and sitcom gags. I don't read storefront signs in the show Queer Eye. 1, because I don't watch terrible shows, and 2, because I don't expect there to be a visual gag in Queer Eye. When I watch The Simpsons, I know to read the signs. There's always a joke in them. But why do I know? Though I see a storefront in Queer Eye with the same eyes, though I am physically taking in an equal amount of visual information, when I watch The Simpsons versus when I am watching Queer Eye, I am not seeing in the same way. When I read this visual gag, I come with a knowledge of the conventions of language, with the ability to make certain assumptions and not others. I am reading in a different way. There's no inherent reason someone couldn't walk away from this gag, assuming that it was formerly Chuck's feed and seed. But there is a whole infrastructure of language, culture, and social conventions that allow us to see and read that Chuck f***ed and s***ed. When the means of knowledge production shifted in the 19th century, it forced humans to see and read nature in a different way. People read and saw and understood in fundamentally different ways. The anthropomorphic gaze towards nature shifted. Humans began to study nature as if it had a direction, order, function, system, ultimately seeking purpose. So, what happens when we assume that nature has a purpose? Well, for one, it allows us to understand the world in a different way. Darwin's theory of evolution is one spectacular illustration of biological thinking. He kinda ate with those finches. This goes hard. But it gets a little trickier when we apply this whole idea of function to human beings. Not in the sense of understanding respiration or the cardiovascular system, but in terms of humanness itself. We begin to put humans into boxes. We begin to impose mechanistic purposes that, under the label biological science, feels objective and inflexible. When we apply biological thinking to human beings, we start to project our cultural ideas onto the human body. We take invisible abstractions like function and combine them with our own cultural assumptions to give those assumptions the scientific mark of approval. But biological function, organic systems, scientific legitimacy, those are all just ideas. They're ideas that can be used in the service of creative, liberating theories or repressive regimes. Unfortunately, in the past 200 years or so, humans have tended towards the repressive stuff. The biological study of sex hasn't been any different. For much of human history, our understanding of gender was governed by men with a lot of time on their hands. In ancient Greece, Aristotle believed that men and women were fundamentally divided by temperature, that men were hot and that women were cold and evil or something. Whichever guy wrote the Bible said that God created man and then woman out of man's rib, and that this prototypical woman betrayed everything and was evil or something. Coincidentally, all these men came to the conclusion that women were bad and that men were really cool and smart, ultimately establishing a fundamental division between men and women. It's beyond the observation that there are penises and vaginas.
Western culture has divided humanity into 2 coherent groups with 2 inherent and opposing spiritual essences, one that underlies the logic of difference itself, the metaphor to end and begin all metaphors, the reference point of all opposition, a binary structuring pattern that would attach itself to all of human history forever. That probably didn't have any cultural ramifications, though. So there were some cultural ramifications. There's no time to go over the history of the patriarchy and the gender binary, but let's just say that by the 19th century, people were pretty bought into the binary opposition between men and women, and also that women sucked. For much of Western history up until this point, the church was the final authority over society's sexual discourses, and they were team #only2genders. But after the Enlightenment, and especially in the late 19th century, the church's authority over cultural institutions began to slip away. Yet the model of binary sex still remained a core part of culture, just that people began to understand binary sex in a different way. With the rise of capitalism in the 19th century, institutional power shifted towards the hands of industry and governance. The church lost its death grip on culture, leaving it in the hands of capitalists and state authority. Society's central cultural core transformed from Jesus stuff to profit and productivity, function, system, plan, direction. As capitalism became the dominant political and economic form of organization, these ideas became central to cultural life, and even to life itself in the form of biology. It isn't a coincidence that the creation of capitalism coincided with the creation of the biological sciences. The two fit together perfectly. Capitalism, at the level of both governance and industrial expansion, required bodily control, the non-sexy kind. Capitalists and nation-states, to maximize productivity and governance, wanted to understand how the human body worked, how it could be standardized and instrumentally controlled to work in the service of profit and power. So in the 19th century, governments and capitalists turned to new scientific disciplines for an answer. Sociology, psychology, biology, economics, among others. Alongside powerful political and economic institutions, these new scientific disciplines produced knowledge with the aim of understanding and controlling populations in the service of powerful interests. Now, when I'm explaining these concepts, I'm personifying concepts like capitalism and the state to convey the process of historical change. But in doing that, I run the risk of making it sound like there was an exceptionally evil plot to take over the world, which isn't exactly how people work. There isn't one evil guy. Historical change is messy. There's a bunch of people in wagons and shit. If I had to ride a wagon, I'd also turn into an evil capitalist. The point is, capitalism started capitalisming, industry started industrializing, and governments started governing in new ways, and all these different sectors of society needed new forms of knowledge in order to do that. Society was changing rapidly, and different interest groups wanted to study that change and use it to build their version of a new world. People wanted to investigate things like how to best discipline students, or how to arrange a factory floor in the most efficient way. These research agendas assumed that hierarchy and economic productivity were good things because capitalism needs hierarchy and economic productivity to produce results. There was a new collective atmosphere, a cultural shift towards system, function, and purpose. A part of this cultural shift was a drive to understand the rational and material function of the human body. After all, if we can't find human purpose in Jesus stuff, then let's at least try to figure out what the fuck a pancreas is, right? For profit. And who was tasked with discovering the human form's finite truth and function? Biology. So of course, with this new cool conceptual lens, people wanted to understand this wacky little thing called sex. Males and females, men and women, all in terms of system, function, and purpose. As biologists began to study sex, they expected to find some kind of final essence, some fundamental distinguishing characteristic that would finally explain all of the assumed differences between men and women, the masculine and feminine, the metaphor to end all metaphors, the logic of difference itself. But instead, they found something else. Late 19th century biologists, as they began to study life in all of its forms, came to understand sex in a different way. In studying various species of animals, biologists discovered that sex wasn't a simple binary division symbolically contained in a genital. Sex was a complex system of hormones and internal bodily communication all intertwined with other functional systems. Biologists found that many species were naturally intersexual, or at least that most life forms carried diverse sexual potentials. And they eventually came to find that humans
weren't so different. Thanks to these new scientific observations and possibly their crippling cocaine addictions, 19th century biologists concluded that the truth of sex no longer originated in the spirit or in one single organ, but a flexible bodily network. Even Charles Darwin came to appreciate this idea in his study of birds, as he stated,
"In every female, all the secondary male characters, and in every male, all the secondary female characters, apparently exist in a latent state, ready to be evolved under certain conditions. We see something of an analogous nature in the human species."
Biologists began to understand the body, and therefore sex, not as a fixed state, but as a flexible hormonal system. Our bodies, when exposed to different hormones and environments, are actually quite flexible and adaptable. Our bodies are themselves complex environments that are not 100% pink or blue. There is a system of communication within us all, wired to carry different potentials, ready to be unlocked and transformed dramatically. After I took testosterone, I underwent a radical transformation from a smooth, noodly child into a hairy manlet. Hormones are powerful. 19th century biologists came to similar conclusions.
Absolute masculinity or absolute femininity in any individual represents an imaginary ideal. A 100% man is as non-existent as a 100% woman.
For a moment, it seemed as if bodily understanding could have moved in a radically liberating direction. But the way these new biologists came to understand the function of sex butted heads with centuries-old understandings of male and femaleness as fundamentally separate. Scientific institutions didn't want to make room for new understandings, and instead found ways to make their scientific research fit within a pre-existing paradigm. What follows in the history of biology will allow us to answer our initial question. What happens when we assume that nature has a purpose? And what happens when new discoveries challenge our previous theories of nature's purpose? What are the consequences of modernist tropes like function, system, and instrumentality? Let's find out. World War I put a temporary pause on the fun of discovering the complexities of biological sex. But after that whole mess, the 1920s started to roar, and social reform movements rejuvenated people's interest in the study of sex, but in a more racist way. Famously rich person John D. Rockefeller Jr. was one of these social reformers concerned with the state of societal ills, but again in a racist way. He decided to fund a new organization called the Bureau of Social Hygiene, whose goal was the study, amelioration, and prevention of those social conditions, crimes, and diseases which adversely affect the well-being of society, with special reference to prostitution and the evils associated therewith. Although the Bureau of Social Hygiene wasn't an explicitly eugenicist organization, should I even finish the sentence? So yeah, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was pretty into eugenics, and so were a lot of the people associated with the Bureau. This becomes uncomfortably relevant as the organization comes to play a key role in the history of contemporary sex research. Eventually, some people within the Bureau proposed that a proper understanding of social ills required special research into human sexuality. So researchers within the Bureau founded the Committee for Research in Problems of Sex, or the CRPS. It was first envisioned as an interdisciplinary endeavor that combines psychology, anthropology, biology, endocrinology, sociology, and other interested disciplines. They saw the problem of sex as a broad and diverse research agenda. But you know, there's always some guy who ruins the vibes and destroys everything. He's usually named Travis, but this time his name was Frank Lilly. Frank decided that the interdisciplinary approach was for Nancy boys, and that the CRPS should take a scientifically rigorous and non-biased biological approach to gender. But see, the thing is, Frank's rigorous and objective approach was as biased as one could get. Frankly, Frank was a very politically involved person, whose standards of objectivity were no less subject to social bias than any other. He, like many of his colleagues, was a strong advocate of eugenics, and believed in using biology to create a racially, sexually, and morally pure society. Now, I'm not one of those people who believes that just because certain histories are tainted with bad people that we have to cancel entire disciplines like biology. But it's not just one weird guy. A lot of people involved in early sex research were eugenicists, and the Bureau of Social Hygiene's research goals were inherently and inseparably aligned with eugenicists' aspirations towards social purity. The aims of biological sex research in the early 20th century weren't tainted by bad intentions. They were fundamentally oppressive from the beginning. Because what happens when we assume that nature has a purpose? We create sciences that try to justify these purposes after the fact. We begin to find ways to instrumentally calculate how to achieve certain purposes. We begin to control human lives in the name of our socially constructed purposes, functions, and systems. With the Committee for Research in Problems of Sex ready to go, these early 20th century scientists began to search for answers to a question they already answered in their heads long ago. What was the biological truth about sex? Since the sex binary was so ingrained in cultural thought, they assumed that they would find male and femaleness as two cohesive structures of being. But similar to the 19th century biologists, and despite the 20th century's new abilities to extract hormones, these scientists and biologists didn't find what they were looking for again. They didn't find sex as one coherent thing. They found overlap, they found flexibility, they found diversity, and interlocking systems. They found that male hormones appeared in female bodies, and that female hormones appeared in male bodies. The beans from one 7-layer burrito exist in another. They found that sex hormones didn't have any inherent sexual purpose. These hormones played a variety of different roles in the brain, metabolism, bladder, and more. Other medical research began to document cases of intersex people whose bodies didn't fit within these fixed binary conceptions of the body. And so science had a bit of a moment. Even that horrible Frank guy had to admit the puzzling state of things.
There is no such biological entity as sex. What exists in nature is a dimorphism into male and female individuals. Sex is not a force that produces these contrasts. It is merely a name for our total impression of the differences.
Now, of course, the physical characteristics that we label sex are real and material. There are penises and breasts, there are beards and chromosomes, but to assume a coherence between all of these objects is an intentional assumption. In the same way that the idea of life itself is an invisible category that we use because we find it conceptually useful, in the same way that our concepts of humor and rhyme lead us to Chuck's dirty talents, in the same way that the 7-layer burrito is not a flavor in itself but an idea, binary sex is also just a lens. The assumption of a coherent entity, a way of looking at bodies that may be useful for some scenarios and not others. The model of unchanging biological binary sex is just insufficient, and it excludes intersex people born with diverse sexual characteristics and trans people who feel a pull to other categories of being. Like, think of it this way. You're familiar with the periodic table, right? That's a lot of things, huh? The universe is such a diverse and beautiful place, huh? Well, it turns out that 98% of the elements in the universe are either hydrogen or helium. Oh shit, is the universe a binary? Is the Earth just a blue-haired non-binary affirmative action hire? Well, it's a matter of perspective, because even if the universe is 98% hydrogen and helium, as humans, it's really the 2% of matter that matters. There's a lot of human history in that 2%. We don't view the universe as a binary because that isn't a framework that's really useful to us. We, as a society, as humans, decide which lenses and frameworks to use at a particular moment. When scientists were faced with a diversity of elements in the universe, even if most of them constitute only a tiny percent of it, scientists decided to give all of them a seat at the table. In the face of sexual diversity, what did mid-20th century scientists do in response? Did they accept the fact that perhaps binary sex categories don't need to be this essential and trans-historical thing? Did they accept the possibility that maybe binary sex is just a framework for viewing the world that is neither inherently good nor bad, but just one framework among many? Nah. The scientific institution chose to cope. So how would the scientific institution save binary sex? Through gender. The term gender identity is a relatively recent invention coined by Robert J. Stroller in 1964 and soon after popularized by sexologist John Money.
Why don't more people know about John Money and Alfred Kinsey?
Evidently, there are forces that don't want this information out.
What are you talking about, Matt? I learned about John Money in 2nd grade. Everyone's talking about John Money. Have you even read Preciado? Have you read Jill Peterson? Have you read Fausto Sterling? Have you even read Butler? Oh, my bad. I forgot Matt can't read. Alright, well, I'll talk about John Money. But first, gender. With the way contemporary discourse is going, you might get the impression that the concept of gender signals the destruction of binary sex categories as we know it. As the anti-gender movement argues, queer wave feminists promote gender to erase the reality of sex and promote dangerously fluid identity. But that's just not true. If we look at history, we find the exact opposite scenario. As the historian Jules Jill Peterson documents, the concept of gender actually saved the male and female binary from confronting the complex reality of biological sex. Today we think of sex as the firm and binary biological expression of male and female categories, and gender as the flimsy and fruity cultural expression of being a man or woman. Or at least, that's what I learned at the diversity seminar. We can thank John Money for popularizing this distinction. Here's how that happened. Back in the 1950s, after decades of confronting the complexities of biological sex, medical researchers thought that they finally had the whole sex thing under control with chromosomes, but then they discovered that some people don't have XX or XY chromosomes and that the binariness of sexual expression in the body was still pretty complex. Cases of intersex people especially forced researchers to confront the reality that not every person conforms to a sexual binary. John Money was one of these researchers, but Money couldn't accept the possibility of sexual diversity. Money couldn't accept that some people could possibly fall outside of the binary. Money advocated for a concept that could save sex from total destruction. He advocated for the term gender as a distinct entity from sex. Gender was to describe the cultural and psychological experience of the masculine and feminine. He called an individual's sense of belonging to these roles gender identity. He theorized that young kids are born with flexible psychological concepts of gender that can be molded through early intervention. But contrary to what commentators like Matt claim, Money didn't create the concept of gender to advocate for free gender fluidity or to destroy Judeo-Christian Western civilization. In fact, Money was adamantly opposed to the idea that one could be a mix of genders. No, he believed in the gender binary as an ultimate goal, and he intended to use medical technology to force non-normative kids to conform to the pre-existing gendered status quo. He abused and horrifically experimented on non-normative, especially intersex children, inventing technologies of oppression to get their bodies to fit his arbitrary understanding of the sexual binary. As medical institutions at large confronted non-normative people and experiences, they created ideologies and technologies to redirect nonconformity. They assumed that nature would give them coherence, and when it didn't, they created that coherence at the expense of the lives they labeled incoherent. As Jill Peterson writes,
"Gender was never meant to undermine sex or advance feminist projects. The concept of gender was meant to save the sex binary from imminent collapse by offering a new developmental justification for coercive and normalizing medical intervention into intersex children's bodies."
What happens when we assume that nature has a purpose? And what happens when nature seems to stray from the purposes that we assign? Violence, coercion, control. It's a violence that continues today. In many of the states that currently ban gender-affirming care for trans kids, so-called genital normalizing surgeries on intersex kids is still legal. Gender is not a new radical phenomenon. It is the historical residue of our investment in normative categories. As it's used in the dominant anti-queer culture, it is a framework that is used to put bodies on a path. Through the lens of gender, we've unlocked a new era of identity and our relationship to the body that may not end in the liberal dream of free-floating fluidity. Prolific trans theorist Paul B. Preciado puts it this way:
if the concept of gender has introduced a rift, the precise reason is that it represents the first self-conscious moment within the epistemology of sexual difference.
In his book, Testo Junkie, Preciado argues that the post-World War II moment is a new era of sexual identity and bodily practice. Western culture no longer views the body as a fixed and unchanging surface that contains essences of maleness or femaleness. The concept of gender gives the complex materiality of the body a direction. Binary gender works in tandem with biological technologies that colonize our bodies so that they fit dominant cultural understandings of humanness. According to Preciado,
the body is not passive living matter, but a techno-organic interface. A techno-living system segmented and territorialized by different textual, data processing, biochemical, political technologies.
When nature could not give us purpose, doctors, scientific institutions, and the pharmaceutical industry invented it. Bodies have become walking laboratories of strict hormonal regulation. Where bodies and lives deviate from the norm, technologies fill in the gaps. But this isn't just about gender, this is about everything.
Technoscience has established its material authority by transforming the concepts of the psyche, libido, consciousness, femininity and masculinity, heterosexuality and homosexuality, intersexuality and transsexuality into tangible realities. They are manifest in commercial chemical substances and molecules, biotype bodies, and fungible technological goods managed by multinationals. The success of contemporary technoscience consists in transforming our depression into Prozac, our masculinity into testosterone, our fertility/sterility into the pill.
Gender and sex exemplify this change. With the mid-century sexual revolution, the public gaze turned on the body. As cultural industries mass-produced images of ideal male and female bodies, new surgeries became available so that one could match a normative ideal. If someone falls outside the binary of established male and female function, you could prescribe that function in a pill, in a diet, in a food product. With mass culture came mass gender, a mass technological effort of bodily production that turned gender into a biological drag performance. Society no longer regulates the body from the outside. Society enters the body itself as a biotechnical prosthesis. But why is the change of sex the limit line? Why does the institution freely allow people to surgically alter every part of their body, but the second they want to alter their genitals or their sex hormones, they have to talk to therapists? They're told that they have some condition? Why do we criminalize trans kids on puberty blockers, but encourage doctors to alter intersex babies' bodies against their will? Why can a man so easily get a prescription for testosterone if he claims low T, but someone assigned female must cross barrier after barrier? If these institutions have constructed gender, is there a way to deconstruct it? So, if the sex and gender distinction doesn't come from nutty left-wing gender theorists, then what do these nutty left-wing gender theorists actually have to say? Well, what we've been hearing for a while, that gender is a social construct, but what exactly does that mean?
Imagine for a moment that we live in a world where everyone and everything exists in a floating 2D space. Now imagine that we live in a world that defines humanness in terms of triangleness. In this world, to be a perfect human is to be a perfect equilateral triangle with 3 equal sides and sharp 60-degree angles. Also in this world, humans have invented the concept of triangularity, which, in their world, is the quality of approximating the perfect triangle. But similar to the real world, not everyone in our little 2D world is perfect. While many, even most people, approximate this perfect triangleness in some way, no one is born with perfect sharp 60-degree edges. No one's sides are exactly equilateral or straight. Some people's sides are a bit on the long side, some on the flat side. And though everyone thinks of themselves in terms of triangularity, though everyone measures their place in the world with reference to the perfect triangular idea, the amount of people who actually match this ideal perfect triangle being are a tiny percentage of the population. Now, some of the less triangular among us might say something like, hey, I think that triangularity is a social construct. And those who more closely match the perfect triangle might say,
How the hell is triangularity a social construct? God made us in his perfect triangular image, the Holy Trinity, 3 sides and 3 angles. And that person, in a way, might be kind of right. A lot of people do approximately look like the perfect triangle. But to say that triangles are a social construct is not to deny the reality of people's bodies. Nor is it to say that the concept of triangularity doesn't exist, or that triangularity doesn't affect the world, or that triangularity is a totally arbitrary distinction that comes from nowhere. Instead, when the less triangular among us say that triangularity is a social construct, they are saying that the perfect triangle is a category that humans invented. The perfect triangle is an image, an idea. It is the symbolic referent that allows us to make claims of coherence, difference, and similarity. The transcendent symbol that allows one to say, look, we all basically have 3 sides and 3 angles, triangularity is just a part of nature. But we have to question, why do we even have the concept of a side? Why do we even measure angles in the first place? Did we discover the perfect triangle in nature, or did we, for whatever reason, project triangularity onto nature? Now, we might get some use out of the concept of triangularity. We might get a lot of use out of it, but it's still important to acknowledge that the perfect triangle isn't inherent to human life. It's an invisible lens that literally shapes the way we see reality, the way we measure difference, the way we understand each other, the way we value human worth, and that perhaps triangularity is just one lens among many. It's a lens that we should make sure is applied in a way that doesn't lead to harm, oppression, or exclusion. Because why would we let a category limit our life's possibilities, right?
Gender and sex are categories that define what bodies can be and do. And though most people tend to have one normative set of genitals, a certain normative configuration of hormones, and tastes that tend to develop in line with social expectations, to say that sex or gender is some core that is at the root of this variation is to work in reverse. Because yes, these differences exist, but it is a socially conditioned choice to use the lens of man or woman to organize these various observations into 2 specific categories with rigid social expectations. Everything from the way we view and use the body, our expectations of other people and ourselves, it's all conditioned by the social frameworks that guide our decision to even create these categories in the first place. So you might be familiar with a little queer theorist named Judith Butler, either because you think they're a demonic entity destroying Western civilization, or a based gender punk destroying Western civilization. Back in the day, they wrote a book called Gender Trouble, where they argue that gender is a performative social construct. This twisted a lot of panties, but many people misunderstood what they meant. But I think Butler's work is important, specifically because it completely disagrees with what conservatives today call gender ideology. Butler doesn't believe in the sex and gender distinction. They don't think people are born with essential gender identities, nor do they think that sex or gender isn't real. Butler argues that gender is performative. But the word performative has a specific definition. The performative utterance is a concept taken from philosopher J.L. Austin. He argued that language doesn't just exist for the purpose of talking shit. Language also has the power to do shit. It has the power to create reality itself. The classic example is a marriage ceremony. When a groom says, "I do," he's not just saying something or describing something, he's also doing something. He's enacting the marriage contract. The "I do" transforms reality by turning a bachelor into a husband. And you know what else? He's getting married to another man. Didn't see that one coming, huh? Judith Butler takes the concept of performative utterance, that thing we just described, and extends it to everything. After a very strong bong rip, Butler began to wonder if all of reality was just like language, man. What if language, in the sense of symbols, words, and patterns of meaning, in a way, creates reality, man? What if all of our language is performative, in the sense that language is the thing that gives the world meaning? It's the thing that allows us to understand the world and form a relationship to the world, because otherwise the world would just be
dead and incoherent goop. And in that sense, language creates reality. All language is performative because language is the process of creating our reality as we understand it. Since Judith Butler was a raging SJW, they decided to apply this lens to their special interest, gender. They argue that gender itself is performative. Gendered reality is created by the way we use our body to convey meaning, in our mannerisms, in our way of dressing, in our everyday roles and habits. Our bodily acts, through a type of bodily language, socially create and recreate gender every day. Butler doesn't believe that gender comes from some internal core, not from our chromosomes or from our brain. They believe that gender and our experience of gender comes from the repetition of acts that we have labeled masculine and feminine. Gender is the process of giving and enacting meaning through the way we use and shape our bodies. As we grow up in the world, we come to learn and internalize gendered meanings in a way that is both uniquely our own, but that also builds our identity out of cultural material that isn't our own. But this totally contradicts how we understand gender in everyday life. It even contradicts the narratives that we're supposed to believe about trans people. As trans people, we're told that we're born with a gendered brain that gives us an unshakable sense of gender identity. I'm told that as a trans man, I have a male brain. But I don't think that's true, because maleness, masculinity, manhood, those are changing and evolving social patterns, and the brain itself is a changing and evolving organ that no one really understands. And when scientists have analyzed brains to try to find male or female structure, they find that brains don't really work that way. They aren't really dimorphic, and everyone has a different mosaic of neurological features. I understand why, as trans people, we want to find that one hard piece of evidence that we could point to and say, hey, we're real, science has proved it, you see? So we come up with these discourses that argue that we're born this way or that our brains are marked with the truth. That's not going to work. One, because we're asking for recognition from a gendered system that was not built to accommodate us. And two, because it just isn't true. And that doesn't mean that trans people aren't real, or that our identities are made up, or that we don't deserve dignity. In fact, it allows us to see the more radical truth, that all gender, even the gender of cisgender people, is based on complex social and psychological attachments and investments. All gender is constructed, and all gender identity is rooted in the way we individually process our social world. But there's some important things to keep in mind. Just because gender is socially constructed does not mean that trans people choose to be trans, or that gender isn't real. It doesn't mean that people have control over their gender identity, or at least how we experience our gender identity. It does not mean that gender identity is arbitrary, or that even gender roles are arbitrary. So then, why are people trans? The better question is, why does anyone have a gender identity? Why do we as humans form deep attachments to the worlds that we create? The truth is that nobody knows. But everyone experiences it. Everyone is born into the world, forms deep psychic attachments to categories, and everyone, from the normative to the least normative person, has a complex and incomplete relationship with their identity. Some people feel at home in certain categories and not at home in others. I, as a trans man, couldn't function in a female role, but live a pretty good life as a man. I don't know why, but it just works for me. But for some reason, people consider my gendered attachments to be abnormal. Something in my brain went wrong. What a lot of people don't understand is that trans people aren't the only people who have gender trouble. Gender is a powerful social norm, and since human beings are not as perfect as the categories that we create, even cisgender people feel gendered incongruence. They, too, can feel incomplete in the norms assigned to them.
Many cis men and women alter their bodies through plastic surgery to fit the ideal masculine and feminine forms. Some men who can't grow beards undergo beard transplants to live their truth. Cisgender boys and men with gynecomastia grow breasts. And some choose to have surgeries, yes, even children, to feel more at home in their bodies. A lot of women go through great lengths to remove unwanted body hair. We can criticize the way gendered categories are imposed upon us, but this is all to say that just like cisgender people, trans people form attachments
to certain categories.
We often desire the same norms that cisgender people do, just in a non-normative way. While most people feel gender incongruence to some extent in their lives at some point, we only pathologize this incongruence when a trans person experiences it. To long for your gendered assignment is a virtue, but to long for another assignment is a sin. Why do we encourage some forms of bodily intervention and not others? Why do laws freely allow parents to irreversibly alter intersex children's genitals against their will, but when trans kids desire puberty blockers, which are reversible, the whole English-speaking world has to get involved? Why do we give medical institutions the power to decide the parameters by which we can shape our bodies? I'm kind of over the old gender ideology. Let's make a new one. As I transitioned through the medical system in my adolescence, I came to associate my trans life with hostility, bureaucracy, and precarious vulnerability. After all, as a trans kid, you spend a lot of time telling a bunch of random doctors intimate details about your identity in the most cold and clinical settings possible. As a trans kid, I was an object of examination. The doctors scanned my words for a list of symptoms. My life was a case study to be read by someone else's gaze. For a long time, that's just what I understood my gender identity to be. During my medical transition, I learned to reproduce the narrative that my transgender identity had to be justified by pain and shame. I learned to accept that the medical institution had the power to tell me when and why my pain was enough. I was conditioned to hurt in a certain way to get what I needed. And I started to believe it. Why do we medicalize and pathologize certain relationships to gender and not others? Our collective attachments to normative gender ideas are strong, but institutions control who gets access to these normative attachments. Some queer theorists suggest that maybe we should just do away with these normative attachments altogether. It's a nice idea, but if we do away with normative attachments, then we'd basically have to kill every person on the planet. But what we can do is understand how to live with normative attachments, at least for the moment. How do we work towards justice when historically oppressive norms assert themselves from every level of every institution to even the most intimate parts of our identities? While I don't have a comprehensive answer, I do know where we can look to find it. As Andrea Long-Chu writes in the article, After Trans Studies,
the most powerful intervention scholars working in trans studies can make at this juncture within the academy is to defend the claim that transness requires that we understand, as we never have before, what it means to be attached to a norm, by desire, by habit, by survival.
Everyone has these attachments, trans or not. But how can trans identity and experience help us understand these normative attachments? I identify as a man and feel a strong connection to masculinity. That hasn't always been a good and beautiful thing. The way I now see and feel the world as a man has been influenced by the history of traditional masculinity as a dominating and oppressive force. I'd be naive to say it hasn't been influenced by that, wouldn't I? There are moments when I can feel that history in the ways that I process emotions, the ways I desire, the way I interact with other people. Those are parts of my identity that I don't like. And my unconscious attachments to these aspects of toxic masculinity are my responsibility, but they have not always been my choice. And listen, I've made videos exploring the topic of toxic masculinity, how it's shit, how men need to take responsibility in overcoming it, but I want to be honest here. My journey through gender as a trans person hasn't always been the beautiful thing that liberals tell you that it is. That doesn't mean that there aren't beautiful parts of being trans, or that trans men should feel ashamed for identifying with masculinity after we have fought so hard to claim that right. But the process of acquiring a gender identity, whether you are trans or cis, requires one to undergo the trauma of confronting a language that we took no part in creating. As a man, I am psychologically invested in the male category and am now unconsciously linked to that problematic history whether I like it or not. I, like all people, have to wrestle with these attachments. Psychoanalysts Avgi Sakatopoulou and Anne Pellegrini wrote a neat little yellow book called Gender Without Identity. In it, they make some seemingly sus claims.
that no one is born trans or queer, and that, yes, gender identity, sexuality, all of that can be informed, mediated, and built from psychic trauma. It's a scary argument to make, especially when the right wing argues that queer people are deviants who are messed up in some way that cause their abnormal identifications. But Sakatopoulou and Pellegrini do not argue, as many right-wingers do, that non-normative genders and sexualities are the direct result of traumatic experience. If trauma could turn you gay, then we'd all be gay. Instead, they argue that all gender, the gender of cis, trans, agender, non-binary, all gender experiences are in part shaped by the trauma inherent in human experience, both the trauma that is directly experienced by the individual and that which is intergenerationally inherited. For these psychoanalysts, gender and sexuality is a form of unconscious self-theorization. It is the way that our psyche poetically translates the mess that we are all handed by culture, by language, by our parents.
And so we're not saying trauma causes gender or trauma causes sexuality, but we can think of it as a force. And people do things with their force. We're not just stopped dead in our tracks by trauma. We can do things with it. And one of the things that we do with trauma as human beings is we actually elaborate a self, a gendered self, a sexual self.
Queerness is not the result of a specific or exceptional type of trauma. It isn't something that can be predicted or changed. It isn't a deviation from healthy developmental paths. It is neither bad nor good, neither functional nor dysfunctional. It is just the random way that our psyche translates our experience into attachment and identity.
We provide a framework that refuses born this way notions of queer and trans experience in order to show that what gives gender its intrapsychic grip is the fact that it proceeds from the subject's own autopoetic process.
When right-wingers claim that gender or sexuality is the result of trauma or abnormality, they do this under the guise that one can change and therefore eradicate queerness. Sakatopoulou and Pellegrini emphasize time after time that gender and sexuality is not something that we can choose or intentionally change.
What this highly mobile process also means is that we do not and cannot control our own or another's gender becoming.
Yet as much as these authors emphasize this point over and over, despite taking a hard stance against transphobia, despite them being queer themselves, despite the work resonating with a lot of other queer people, there's always that fear that their work could be reappropriated by the right-wing sensationalist machine. But they said f*** it, because trans people deserve a better discourse.
We don't think people are born trans. We also don't think they're born normatively gendered, or what has come to be called cis. We think that all gender and all sexuality is something people acquire in a very complex way. This isn't about choice, like you wake up in the morning, pull down the Facebook drop-down menu and decide, I'm going to be this, right? But the other thing is that, again, we're psychoanalysts and we sit and we listen to people. We think that trauma may well play a part in how anyone comes into their gender or comes into their sexuality, not just trans people, not just queer people. But we think that trauma actually shapes the everyday experience of gender and of sexuality for everyone.
We can't let born this way narratives keep trans activism captive in the hopes that one day trans folks will suddenly acquire pronouns and stop wishing for our destruction.
'Cause you were born this way, baby.
No, we owe it to queer people to honor the complexity of gender as an autopoetic psychic self-translation in all of its beauty, violence, autonomy, force, and unintelligibility.
And in many ways, part of what we're trying to do in this book is extend the dignity of complexity and nuance to trans and queer people in ways that it has not been for fear that it would be weaponized.
All gender is trauma. All gender is pleasurable. All gender involves bodily desires, incongruences, sadness, joy, creativity, and normativity. All gender is technological, artificial, unnatural, socially influenced. But we only create laws and phobias against transgender, against intersex bodies, against the non-normative. The state regulates trans kids' puberty more than their fucking school lunch. Literally, what is this? Oh, but transition is radical. Transition is permanent. Well, you know what else is permanent? all puberty. And let me tell you, going through puberty as a girl didn't feel like I was fulfilling nature's beautiful purpose. From the moment I became conscious of what it meant to be female, I became conscious of the way that older men looked at me. I became conscious of my objectification, of the scars that girlhood and womanhood would entail. All gendering, even the so-called natural or normal process of growing up with a gender, involves permanent physical and psychic traumas. Yet when a child or adolescent, hell, even an adult, decides that they want to choose their own gendered path, maybe even a different path, we call that disordered. We call it abnormal. We call it a deviation. It doesn't have to be. What if we learn to form a different relationship with the body, with identity? What if we freed sex characteristics from their institutional cage? What if we built a world that actually celebrates trans kids, that wants to see more trans kids in the world? A world that sees the rise of trans kids not as a sign of an epidemic, but as the signal of a world that has a new and freer relationship to social norms. Now, I'm not advocating for all doctors to take every single child and immediately trans them. We have to acknowledge that we live in a world where transition is a radical and life-altering decision. But that's not a problem with us. That's a problem with the world and what it's like. I think that mainstream trans activism currently paints this picture of trans life as this small group of afflicted people who just want to carve out a quiet little pocket of society. And that's not totally inaccurate. That's how, under the current social system, many trans people experience and understand their lives, and that's fair. Some people are just trying to survive. It's what I did for all those years that I was stealth, and I would never look down on someone for desiring that life when the world only offers us the alternative of violence. But what if the trans advocates, the public figures, those of us who have the ears of important people, what if those of us who are visible asked for something beyond a quiet little pocket, and asked for a world in which our lives are visible and celebrated?
Today, the discourse surrounding childhood transition continues to attempt this stabilization, with puberty suppression technologies promising a future that erases trans visibility itself. A disturbing reconsolidation of the sex and gender binary that also evokes eugenic echoes of the proper racial phenotypes of human sex from early 20th century endocrinology.
Trans advocacy is just fighting for the right to be like everybody else, for the right to be invisible. Then will we ever be able to form a culture and understanding on our own terms? What if trans activism imagined the future in a different way, for a queer future that, in the words of Jose Esteban Munoz, is not yet here, but to which we're always barreling towards, hoping for?
The genitals are still imprisoned in a pre-modern, sovereign, and nearly theocratic power regime that considers them to be the property of the state and dependent on unchanging transcendental law.
Medical institutions imprison gender and sex in a cage. Mainstream trans activism has been politely asking these institutions for permission to open that cage from time to time, as long as they have a doctor's note. But it doesn't matter how many studies or scientific institutions show that it's okay to unlock the door, because the problem is not only about who gets to open the cage, but the fact that the cage exists in the first place. The problem is that we lock away queer forms of human transformation and not others. The trans experience allows us to see that we can build a new relationship to the body. The body no longer has to be captured by institutions that tell us to be and follow a certain way of being. A trans future might imagine gender not as a site of bodily regulation, but bodily freedom. Yeah, it might be naive, and it's a tall order to expect every trans person to be an advocate for a new gendered future, especially when a lot of us just want to live our lives. But if you're someone who's tired of living the life you are told to desire, who feels limited by the available categories and the available futures, it might help to reflect on the special way we as queer people and trans people imagine the future. Our special way of hoping is powerful. It's rich with the resources for a new world. All it takes is for us to realize it. But what if we get it wrong? What if we let trans kids transition and society goes to shit and millions of kids end up clinically depressed? Well, newsflash, we're already getting it wrong. Society is decently shit and millions of kids are already clinically depressed. Let's stop trying to get it right. Let's stop going in circles seeking some ultimate truth or some final gendered core. To hell with nature's purpose.
If you want to continue to see work like this for free, please consider supporting my Patreon to get access to exclusive videos, a podcast where I talk to other video essayists, and behind-the-scenes adventures. Head to patreon.com/aretheygay to check it out. A big thank you goes out to my current patrons. 321 Gone, Six Slugs, Aaron Seiler, Eris Arlecchino, Aiden Kedzierski, Aiden Lisandro, AJ, Alex Fawnstock, All Pizzas Are Personal, Alnara, Amanda S., Amaranta, Amy Gleeksner, Anna Midkiff, Arapaima Slip, Arrogant Cumtrucks, Ash Flynn, Ataplease, Avery, Barbie V, Burek, Beatrice Dahl, Bela, Bobby Jane Disforges, Brad the Great, Brandon Uzumaki, Brennan, Breens, Sealigs, Campbell, Carter Brained, Cartographic, Catboy Girl, Kaylin S., C. Schaefer, Charles Hero, Charlie Rose, Cheese Boy, Chester Snap, Chloe, Christopher Delano, Cliff, Closeted History, Cobalt Pink, Colin Coltrera, Colin Ungerleader, Cooper, Sig, Dan, Dane Much, Danny Chalice, Daniela de Leon, Danielle McDonald, Declan Wall, D. Hirsch, Domia, Don Hopkins, Draenix, Dropout Ninja, Dian, Easy, EU, Elizabeth Morgan, Ellie Nolan, Ellie J. Vela, Ellie Nar, Emma Anastasi, Erich J. Moffitt, Ermine, Esper Lady, Ethan Thompson, Ava Laney, Eyes of a Tragedy, Fa, Fat Kirk, Fickle Harpy, Flora Feldner, Florencia Rumpel Rodriguez, Frey, Fuzzy Numbers, Gabriella Day, Gabriela Surita, Georgie Dan, Gian Belang, Gray Rainier, Griff Q, Guillerme Tamaki, Gwen Kwasnica, Hannah O, Hannah, Heather Frasechild, Henry, Hida, Hal the Magician, Ian T. Gray, Ipsy, Iris, Irritated Nick, Jack, Jack Bennett, Jacob Palmer, Jade Persuades, Janin, Jay McKenzie, Jenny Tang, Jess, Jess Fisher, Jiminy's Journal, Jinkies, Jocelyn Esther, Joshua Clark, Josie McGaughy, Joxon S. Costello, Julie Werner, Justin Chapman, Kay, Kale, Cara Goolsby, Keaton Galaxy, Kenzie Woodbridge, Knights Who Say Sledge, Laura Bauma, Lauren Walsh, Levi Margolis, Lex Rexless, Lillian, Lynn Shee, Linz, Liz Hirschman, Logan Lind, Luca, Luce, Macy Allen, Mahala Byrne, Malpertuis, Manway, Mark Anderson, Marshall Mazingale, Mars Rover, Matthew Mercer, Maz Swift, Megalomaniac 64, Megan, Megan Lowndes, Mel, Mary, Michael Gillespie, Mick, Mike Kent, Moye, Muhammad Amari, Natalie Rose, Nawurg, Nicholas Bloom, Nick H., Nomi Fletcher, Naifan, Oksana Amador,
Omar Apollo's Strongest Soldier, Oyster Philosophy, Page, Paul, Penguin with a Tie, Phantom Flavor, Phil E., Raunchy Beeves, Richard Knight, Ryoko, Robot Spock, Romano Majongos, Rosamori of the Sea, RSS, Ryan Howard, SH, Sam Gersel, Sarah McDonald, Sarah Parker Schmilt, SG, Shannon Hutchinson, Sidekick, Solberg Birgisdottir, Stephen Gibson, Tanner Clark, Tanya P., Tosh, Taylor White, The Bestie Pepsi Boys, The Illustrious Squeer Dynasty, Timo, Tinishida, Tony Gallagher, Tony Whitson, Trixie, Trill Seeker, Uardito, Umaima Beige, Valued Customer, Vel, Violet Chavez Gilbride, Vivid Disciple, Wainoa, Will Titmus, William Thomas, Zach K.